So Dipesh Chakrabarty, in his book Climate History, he talks about climate and uncertainty of extreme events as an issue of scale and temporal horizons. And the other element that he also notes is that when we're talking about our strategies of risk management, it all comes from how we calculate probability. So when we're looking at the IPCC report at the projected changes, when we're looking at different flooding projections or heat, we're trying to kind of work within the series of statistical probability, something that's often difficult to comprehend for some of those not living day by day within this climate realm and scientific realm. And within the planning world and the design world, we're often encountering a moment where we have to communicate this to our peers, to our community, to city agents, to engineers, and try to kind of have this comprehensive overlook of everything that can happen. And he also criticizes the way our modern life thinking is kind of based on this relative stationarity of our urban environments, where we're kind of living in one place, we're unable to move, and we just need to adapt to whatever changes and kind of keep protecting ourselves in a way. So one of the things that I like to start with is thinking about temporal awareness, how we think about time, how we think about time in the short term when we're talking about risk, how we're thinking about time in the geological sense, so looking at the processes and the environmental, and understanding these kind of different scales. The geologist Marcia Bjornjord advocates in her book Timefulness on this kind of timefulness and polytemporality. So trying to look at every landscape through this geological perspective, through understanding that we're here within this environment and we're kind of part of this long-term process that might have started many years before even kind of civilization settled in this location. And this kind of a view can be applied to social histories and policies that are shaping the urban realm. And one of the projects that we kind of started doing with my students at UH was kind of doing the same thing with Houston. And I don't know, Houston is kind of, let's say, not a very exciting city to visit as a tourist, so people don't often encounter it. But it is a very interesting case study for climate adaptation, because we do manage to experience multiple climate events during our hurricane season or even in the winter. So we can always surprise you with our climate disasters. And one of the things that we started looking at was essentially kind of the soil map. And when we're looking at the soil map and we read the description, the soil map says that nearly level clay and loamy prairie soils. So the city of Houston was built on this kind of flat marshy area that was slowly drained throughout the last 100 years. It hasn't been around for that long, the city. And then essentially, it was always supposed to flood as a marsh. And throughout the time, water started to be managed within the system. So if we're reading kind of this ad for the real estate venture that is Houston from August 1836, the Allen brothers described Houston's nearly level landscape and poorly drained prairie soil as beautifully elevated, salubrious, and well-watered. This was obviously a kind of real estate scheme to attract people to come and move to the city. And a century later, one of their descendants provided a more realistic description, referring to the area as a swampy jungle. The project to drain this humid waterscape sentenced a flexible system that is the bayou system. And bayous are kind of these small waterways that are walking across this marshland into stationarity. So within each flood event in the recent years, and when we're looking at this kind of large system of bayous and watersheds, we kind of constructed a new layer of water management, detention ponds, diversion tunnels, drainage ditches, and all kind of entangled within this urban infrastructure. And this perpetual maintenance and expansion of complexity exacerbated climate risks from multiple reasons. When we're trying to contain water within this kind of system of concrete banks, water moves faster, and it also doesn't collect sediment, so we're contributing to subsidence, to the sinking of soil. And then we're also not building new soil and creating a kind of and fertilizing the banks of the floodplain. And the other areas are also issues of equity. When the flooding, when kind of the management of water was reliant on built infrastructure, areas that don't have built infrastructure, like the photo on the right that has these like drainage ditches that are not maintained, are becoming more vulnerable increasingly to flooding. And it happens especially in underserved communities. So when we're trying to document kind of this history of transformation and drainage, and how we try to rein the floodplain, we are trying to kind of uncover these histories that Professor Marcia Bjornjord was talking about, and kind of see how the meanders of the bayou and the river used to be, and areas where they were filled or straightened, and how they have this kind of continuous impact on the condition today. But also, like, we're trying to investigate this fragile balance of the bayous, their flat surrounding, and understand how it was used before it became just this sort of like stormwater drainage ditch, how it was used as an ecological, as a valuable ecological space, how it was used as a public space, and how it functioned to kind of the service of um, water drainage and stormwater collection before it became a kind of an engineered concept. So we decided to map this area within Northeast Houston. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but downtown is to the middle left here. This kind of wiggly water pathway is the shipping channel. So Houston is one of the largest ports in the US, and also one of the major oil production and kind of distribution. So all of that area along the watershed has multiple refineries, essentially also connected to the fact that there's a lot of air pollution and additional kind of industrial environmental challenges to the people that reside there. And then we were looking at Lake Houston, that is today a dammed lake and the kind of the main water source to the city, and the San Jacinto River, with the Greens Bayou to the left. That was kind of the second most impacted watershed under Hurricane Harvey. And when we zoom in and see the transformation, urbanization happened very quickly in the recent years. You maybe know, you might heard anecdotes about Houston as the city that has no zoning. So it's one of the only cities that in the US that really doesn't have specific zoning laws. It has deeds, and it has different layers of management and kind of control. Some of them are framed by the communities. The communities have the ability to define how their neighborhoods are developed, but it's kind of up to them to initiate it. And therefore, it contributes to this developer-driven landscape. And in many of these areas, some of the historic marshes and the flatwood marshes were transformed completely into these kind of suburban landscape, especially in recent years. And we can see how the topography completely changed. This kind of white sand square in the left bottom is essentially a landfill that is extremely tall. And because everything is very flat, when you're driving on the highway, you can see it as a sort of mountain in the background of everything else. And we found the oldest map of the city of Houston. And I think being in the UK, you might find this amusing, especially in Cambridge. So the oldest topographical map was from 1916, which is a little bit over 100 years ago. Um, and it shows the Greens Bayou in the middle, and to the left, I don't know if you guys can see this, there are these small circles. The circles are part of this wetland area that's called pimple ponds. And these are kind of tiny areas of ponds that have been developed throughout the years to collect water and manage within this kind of critical wetland area. And to the right, it's the meanders of the San Jacinto River that essentially a few years later in the 50s becomes a dammed lake. And slowly, what drove the transformation and kind of the water system, the hydrological system that started to manage it, is not essentially the landscape, but property ownership. Once people started purchasing lots and practice agriculture in order to create swampland into valuable land, people essentially drained them. And the drainage infrastructure was divided by ownership. Therefore, almost kind of erasing the natural landscape of the prairie and the wetland. And one of the things within this kind of educational exercise we try to do is to bring back and show one how flat it is. So we developed this kind of 3D physical model of the 1916 map with an exaggerated elevation. We exaggerated by 3, so it will look very big. And this whole area is around 25 kilometers by 25 kilometers. And to start kind of visualizing as an educational tool for people what it used to be before it was urbanized and developed, or at least from the last record we actually have. And part of this exercise was also to look at kind of the existing condition, the current condition, the orange boxes on the left that show us how it was changed. So kind of people, visitors were able to exchange those cubes within the existing landscape from the 1916 map with the existing landscape and see how it was actually transformed. So you can see this like one cube that is right in front of me in this photo is the one with that landfill mound that is taller than most of the landscape and was completely man-made. So as we kind of start testing this educational exercise of like understanding the landscape, one of the things that we're trying to communicate is this understanding that it always flooded, and it floods because it's flat, and that's what it's supposed to do. The way the landscape is managed doesn't really account for this understanding, but in order to kind of create the new environmental stewardship and consider new paradigms for living with water, we have to go back and kind of build this narrative from the beginning. So the other aspect of temporal horizons when we're working with climate is this kind of aspiration to create a narrative. And Amitav Ghosh, the novelist, in his book, The Great Derangement, talks a lot about how uncertainty is constructed within the way we tell stories in our society today. And how you always have this sort of kind of mundane, stable timeline, and then something highly improbable happens. And that sort of like brings us this idea of uncertainty. And that's also how we analyze climate events. But if we actually look and observe the history and the landscape, we'll understand that some of these events are part of natural processes. They become more extreme because of how we designed our infrastructure system and where we choose to build. But not all of them are improbable. So the level of uncertainty diminishes a little bit once we start kind of reevaluating how we look at it. And within the context of urbanism and architecture, the lens of uncertainty requires expanding the role and the perspective of the architect and designer to project multiple futures to the community and for the urban realm, and consider impacts and opportunities across scales. And when we're thinking about design as a process of inquiry for transformative opportunities. So when we're kind of looking at this timeline, it's this anticipation of potential scenarios and how we build agency for design to co-produce the future vision for communities. Uh, Part of the work with One Architecture and Urbanism has been kind of starting to look at these long-term plans. We're looking at climate projections, we're looking at these larger areas, and we're trying to envision how it will adapt to the climate risk in 2100, 2070, and then how we work backwards to develop the framework, but also support it with implementable timelines and pathways. Since many of these projects are so big, so comprehensive, and tend to be so transformative across all of the systems, whether it's infrastructure, like subsurface utilities, and kind of the built environment, that will take a very long time, will take a lot of policy change, and essentially will take a lot of funding. And the other element of many of these projects is working with the community. One is that once we start kind of diving into vulnerabilities, many of the communities that are most vulnerable to climate impacts, at least in these projects across the US, were underserved communities. And this is because of planning patterns, development patterns, but also their capacity to adapt and respond to climate events. When we're thinking about kind of whether it's low income communities that are more impacted and their ability to recover, or people with older people, children, or people with medical conditions that require them to kind of have another layer of response when we're talking about their vulnerabilities. And maximizing public benefit in many of these projects is the way we provide value. We're not thinking about climate adaptation projects within the urban realm as an infrastructure project, but it's an urban kind of placemaking approach that also serves as infrastructure. And the important emphasis on this placemaking and co-benefit for the communities, specifically because, at least within the context of the US, we'll need to justify the funding for it. And if it's public funding, it's always better to have the buy-in, but also better to support the needs of the communities, because to make these projects sustainable for the long term, they will need to be the stewards of that environment. So kind of the stratigraphy of approaching this project is often kind of this multi-layered. We're talking about the context, the geography, the environment, the natural processes, and the palimpsest of in this core approaching uncertainty. The community is the driver when we're talking about their history, the culture, traditions, the governance and policy that shaped the land, kind of reclaimed land, how agency decided what goes where. And then systems of infrastructure, so everything that happens above surface, but also utilities that are buried underground and will need to be moved or transformed or even fail at an event of a climate emergency. So the case for adaptation, let's say, is fairly straightforward, but I think especially after this morning's news, it's important to kind of think how we can talk about it and how we can build the argument and the urgency for climate adaptation to a wider audience, even if we're not necessarily thinking about kind of extreme projections of climate. So when we're looking at this kind of overview of timelines as defined by the recent IPCC report, but also been kind of shown throughout the years, we basically see that by 2050, we have kind of, let's say, stability. And then the climate will become more extreme with more frequent extreme events towards 2100. So let's say if we're thinking about planning and long-term scenarios, it gives us 50 years to figure out what we're doing and how we respond to this within the urban realm. And I'm specifically talking about adaptation and kind of leaving mitigation aside at this moment, because it's part kind of this like trying to make an argument that will work with different views of climate change. So the political will, as we can see here, is important because we're relying on funding and the ability to kind of adapt policies. But also we need to find a way to work around it, again, within this morning's context, and how we kind of start adapting our environment, how we start driving the adaptation in the built environment um, in a way that doesn't necessarily rely on the top-down policy decisions of politicians. And one of the things that one of the arguments that the Chakrabarty makes that I find very compelling is that we already know what is the risk. We already know enough. And we see climate events, we see these kind of weather extremes that are transforming and impacting our cities. In Houston, just in May and April, we had 3 consecutive storms. We had a tornado that was called a derecho that never happened here before. We had a hurricane, Beryl, and then several other storms that were very close to flooding in many areas. So we kind of already see this happening. And just like in the last couple of months, we saw Milton that impacted North Carolina areas that were discussed as climate refuge, something that is not supposed to happen in theory, even though kind of a revision can see that we should have been able to predict some of the patterns. And we kind of already know enough to build the argument around adaptation and transformation of the urban realm. And this is also like a very good diagram from the work at One Architecture, is that when we're overlaying the timeline of climate change with the timeline of urban development, urban funding, and interest, we see that essentially if we're looking at doing something by 2100, everything that we start designing today, building today, will still be in place in 50 years or 70 years. Therefore, in kind of everything we start designing and building today, we need to start thinking of those potential scenarios that will impact it from a climate perspective. And another part of this argument is this research from Oliver Wing and his team that kind of looks at what will be the impacts of climate between risk and equity by 2050. And the interesting finding from this paper, in addition to kind of proving once again that spatial inequity and greater risk to underserved community is something that we have to deal with, is that part of the increase in vulnerability is not necessarily due to the expansion of the floodplain, is because people will move and there will be more people residing within the urban floodplains. Within the floodplains that we now know that they are part of this, without even like projecting into sea level rise. And another study looking at Miami-Dade and Florida by Nadia Sitaram and her colleagues is looking at kind of classification of population in 4 modes of mobility. So stable, migrating, displaced, and trapped, where migrating and trapped are those that are directly exposed to climate. And essentially within time, what they kind of analyze is that the most vulnerable population and people that are trapped and are unable to move out of the areas where they're at great risk is going to increase. And then the migrating areas will also increase. The displaced populations are, as they define, people who are kind of on the social vulnerability scale. However, they will experience gentrification because the migrating folks will start displacing them with future gentrification. So when we're kind of looking at this, urban growth should be a part of a comprehensive plan for a sustainable urban realm, addressing the somewhat invisible challenges of heat, storm, water, and other elements. And essentially looking at this through a kind of complex systems method, because each climate impact correlates and exacerbates the others. So we need to find a way to address all of them, and that's way we produce this kind of most transformative elements of the urban realm. So I'll start with kind of um, a quick overview of a Houston project that actually starts from this kind of small overview of neighborhood scale development and local capacity building, and not necessarily these large projects, because I think within this kind of context of how we work and develop climate adaptation within, let's say, when we're trying to not rely too much on political will, we will need to kind of find a way to work within the capacity of communities. So Harvey was extremely devastating in 2017. And actually, what's interesting about this photo, this is the Buffalo Bayou Park actually doing what it's supposed to. The park is designed to flood, and however, with the intensity of Harvey, that was almost 5 days of intense rain nonstop, it's obviously overflowed its banks and collected an immense amount of sediment. And the history of flooding in Houston, again, going back to kind of the initial analysis, is that there's a flood almost every year since 1900. And it hasn't changed. We just need to kind of find a way to design the infrastructure system better, or develop a different approach that integrates kind of ecological and nature-based solutions to that. And one of the things that we can see a lot in Houston is that because many of the eastern communities, Houston expanded by annexing areas in other neighborhoods. But when they annexed them, they didn't adapt their infrastructure, and often because of funding and different policies, they never modernized them. So communities that might have not have proper drainage or proper infrastructure were sort of like connected back into the city, but they have never been served with appropriate public works services. And unfortunately, because how the amount of flooding and climate events, many of these communities are resilient. And we're saying this in a way as a positive thing, but also these communities say, like, we don't need to be resilient. We should be able not to live with this kind of repeat trauma of climate events. And these communities develop very strong social bonds. They have very strong community support systems that are community-based organizations that are not always connected directly to the government. And just to kind of talk about environmental justice in Houston, you can see this divide. So the blue area is kind of the mainly white, moderate income population, and everything to the right is the people of color with kind of lower income. And also to the right of kind of to the east of this map is also the industrial complexes and the shipping channel and the port. And many of the refineries. And because there's no zoning or regulations, there are many communities who are extremely adjacent to some of these highly polluting areas. So in addition to lack of proper drainage or infrastructure, these communities are also experience multiple levels of health issues that are driven by exposure to these hazards. And the distributive justice continues through kind of multiple layers of infrastructure, whether it's sewer systems, how overflow is drained, and how kind of everything works. And it's an accumulation of this kind of historic processes of disinvestment. It also contributes to these, let's say, peculiar jurisdiction questions. So in many of these areas, you have open drain ditches of the street, where the jurisdiction of maintenance of these ditches is not under the city. It's actually under the responsibility of the property owner next to it. And it creates a problem when we're talking about people who don't really understand what they need to do, don't have time to deal with it, like who really has time to deal with public infrastructure. And then essentially, the city doesn't have a routine maintenance process for some of these drainage systems. And what we see is that these areas flood more because of this kind of lack of investment. So part of the project was to look like how can neighborhood level investment and supporting governance mechanism build community capacity and potentially rely on some of these community organizations to build adaptation strategies or find a way to perhaps rearrange some of the governance system within the city that will allow them access to some of the funding and will allow them access to some of the public services. And this project that was led by One Architecture and Urbanism and was kind of initiated by the previous mayor and the planning department looks at 3 underserved neighborhoods with very different demographic compositions and kind of breaks it down into finding a way to create visions from spatial concepts that are kind of changing in scale to co-producing projects with these community organizations that can also, in a way, support implementation in different ways and seeing how we can work within the existing governance tools of the city. So if there's no zoning, how can a community limit gentrification of the or unwanted development from the community, or how they can support maintenance and operation in the absence of kind of the city's investment. And it all relies on this, I think, kind of heavily on this idea of social infrastructure. So if we're thinking about places and facilities where the community can gather in order to build their own networks and linkages, and then slowly build their capacity to respond to risk. And at the same time, we're kind of focusing on creating those places, creating the infrastructure for these places, but then also supporting the capacity building processes. And the proposals are kind of by scale from adapting homes with different elements, community facilities, streetscape improvements, and then larger projects that are focused on kind of remediation that will require larger effort from a funding perspective and potentially a philanthropic investment. And one of the things I was working on when I was kind of analyzing this project from a perspective, from an academic perspective, was essentially identifying the main challenges that are to implementation and co-production. So we're looking at the scale of institutions that need to be involved in each one of these projects. And one of the kind of things that kept coming back is this relationship between the communities and the local government. And we see kind of the need to institutional reforms because while the Houston governance structure allows communities to have representative and within the city council and drive more change and action, it is still a very strong mayor governance that at the end the mayor decides where the funding will go. So there is like this ability and framework for communities to engage and contribute to change, but there's not always the space within the political realm. And I only have like 10 minutes left, I think. So I'll try to kind of run through kind of other projects that look at this on a larger scale and 3 anecdotes of how resiliency projects can be conceived and developed within the kind of realm of the US and the different policies that are existing. So New York, it's a project that kind of started in 2012 after Hurricane Sandy, and you probably have seen this in many different events. And One Architecture was part of the project with big and other large firms, and it kind of looks at the same issues we started with the kind of Houston example. So in Lower Manhattan, many of the land that is now prone to flooding is the land that once that was reclaimed from the ground. These were marshes that were dried when the city slowly expanded. And today these are low-lying areas. The green areas we can see here are also specifically the kind of areas that used to be marshes, used to be channels, and were dried. So if you're familiar with Lower Manhattan, this the lower green band that cuts through this kind of tongue of the city is Canal Street. So where water always goes back to where it used to be, and water always goes to the lower point. And it's once we kind of start seeing the flood maps, it sort of clicks. We understand how the hydrological landscape we see is reflecting of the transformations we did when we built the ground in those cities. And Hurricane Harvey was extremely disruptive, and I think it also was a paradigm shift for the planning world when um, we started thinking about adaptation as projects that work on co-benefits and multiple benefits for the community and not just infrastructure projects. And it's also kind of goes back to this issue of social infrastructure where the impact is mental on the communities, and the impact is on their capacity to adapt and respond to those risks. So the social linkages are kind of ingrained within this understanding of how we approach these projects. So the project was kind of to connect infrastructure with the program, and I'll run very fast through this, where each one of these elements respond to the neighborhoods that are adjacent to, especially the kind of idea of breaking it down into smaller pieces is also allows us to reduce the project risk, because once we have these smaller U's, each one of them is kind of managed specifically, and we can close each one of them and they don't break as a system. When we're talking about the elevations of these things, and this is kind of the philosophical question of this project, because it was created and funded as part of a response to Sandy, to disaster. And when it happened in 2012, and the project was initiated by 2014, the definition that anything that's built, it has to be built by, start being built by 2021. And actually, just this week, the mayor's office and I think it was Public Works kind of showed how one of the first phases of the project was completed. So the challenge of this is that the limitations of the funding that was given asked people to design the projects to the kind of projected sea level rise and storm level of 2050. So if we're thinking about kind of this timeline of how long it takes to build things and how kind of the extreme events are kind of becomes more extreme and more frequent with time, if we're completing something in 2025 that will be in place by 2050, what will happen after? Like, do we need to rebuild it? Do we need to create an adaptive piece of infrastructure? And these elevations are in feet, but essentially most of the walls and kind of protective systems that were implemented and needs to be implemented are almost at 18 feet. So let's say, so it's almost like one and a half stories tall of a building. And the first project was implemented on this public land, on a public park. It's also protective of a very large area of public housing, which was kind of part of the reason it was funded by the federal government. And the kind of one of the anecdotes is that it's extremely expensive. So the funding that was given by the federal government was 300 million to the whole project, which is kind of the whole U, so the extent of the lower Manhattan. And then this chunk received around 200 million. The final cost of it, however, was essentially over $1 billion because much of the infrastructure has to be done in the subsurface. So as you see from the aerial photo from Ian Bond, there is a power plant and it was impacted by the storm, and all of the utilities has to be moved underground into this kind of flood-proof system. So everything had to be reconstructed. And then the other philosophical question, if we're talking about co-benefit and it's a beautiful park and we want to connect it back to the community, at the end, because of limitations of space, it's still a wall, and it's still something to kind of see as a barrier, even though like you can cross it in multiple locations. The other interesting discussion that happened was whether or not the park should be flooded. Like we had this, some of the images we're talking about this floodable landscape. However, the city that was supposed to manage that is in charge of managing the park was not as interested in kind of trying to recover it after every time it floods, and um, and asked to change the design in order to have the whole park above the flood elevation, um, which also kind of changed the way it's being constructed. So this kind of like moment in time and how much time it will take to construct and the disruption of the project um, to kind of this the FDR, the highway that is there, was part in what was prescribed in the design. So we're kind of thinking of like political decisions that are within this kind of very narrow time frame, which let's say like the 5 years of construction, that are impacting something that will be in place for probably 100 years. um, so it obviously it kind of caused a major outrage. Um, and then how we can kind of ground this in public benefit. The other aspect of this project was the longer term areas that didn't have as much funding. The kind of city and the team was able to propose a longer term planning effort because there was not enough space to develop a similar system. Essentially, it allowed the team to look at kind of a larger array of climate impacts and rethink the urban environment from a comprehensive perspective, from a temperature, coastal storms, and for a longer term. Thinking about kind of this cross section of climate impacts, groundwater level rising, tidal inundation, and all of the extremes might also impact the energy system. So basically, the team built on this kind of toolkit of options at the scale of interventions, from building streets, utilities to outboard and the edge of the water. The issue with the edge of the water is that it's often kind of the simplest solution. We create a beautiful park at the edge, we build new land. We don't have any utilities and challenges because everything is new. And we solve everything in theory. Um, However, the main challenges with this proposal, one is that the policy of um, the Clean Water Act and construction and wetlands limits the ability we can of what we can build, and it kind of makes it more expensive and adds into the timeline of how many policies changes will need to be done. And at the same time, we um, we're kind of need to have a better long-term perspective because again, like we expanded the city by building new land, and now we're building more new land. Um, so how we justify this? And the option of the toolkit is kind of to propose to the city, okay, so there's the risks. Try to respond to as many of them as we can. The building and public realm approach is, let's say, fast and easy. You come to a property owner, they address their building, and they kind of repair whatever they need and adapt to future climate. As we expand and scale and kind of into the public realm, we protect more people, but essentially limit, we expand the timeline, and we have to coordinate with more people. We limit the project success, or like at least challenge it. So we kind of need to be able to manage these different scenarios. Essentially, what happened after this proposal was that also the previous mayor of New York decided to develop this kind of outboard new land solution to protect the area. And there is kind of a conceptual design master plan that looks at it, proposes this kind of beautiful park that also approaches these kind of multiple risks and kind of responds to the needs of the community and to this elevation change. And with whatever we design, we kind of need to kind of go up and down in order to get to the water. And this kind of goes back to this question. Okay, so what does this mean? So we designed something for 2100, but assuming The main assumption here is that we have to protect the financial district, we have to protect New York, and what do we do next? Like in 2100, when things become worse or more extreme, what does it mean for the future? What can be the better long-term solution? And whether kind of the philosophical question of protecting everything is even what needs to be done. So, I mean, do I still have time, or should I wrap up?
Thank you. I think that you will have 5 minutes of so for wrap up.
Okay. So I'll go very quickly. I think also my voice is giving in on me. So what will it take to kind of do this type of transformation that is not local, like in New York, even though these projects are big and very expensive? So in Boston, the approach was a little bit different. The approach was creating a vision plan. And again, it was the previous mayor administration, and often between these kind of transitions, things sort of like wind down. So like whatever you can do within a political term, it doesn't always transfer to the next one. And Boston was also reclaimed. It was a composition of multiple islands, and now within the kind of last 5 years, we see an increase even in king tides, in kind of this sunny day flood events where some of the historic wharfs just kind of inundated with water. And this was what Boston when the British arrived, a kind of a series of islands, and the green areas are marshes. And part of the kind of city building process included the reclamation of multiple territories. And similar to the same narrative we've been building from the beginning, many of these areas that have been reclaimed historically, and we can see here throughout kind of the multiple years, are the same areas that are within the floodplain. So again, water wants to go where it used to be. Boston also reclaimed those areas with clay soil, which again creates kind of this very impermeable surfaces. And the vision the mayor proposed was essentially creating this green band with co-benefits. So this kind of beautiful green park that will wrap around 47 miles of the coastline of Boston and create and allow public access based on the different communities and their needs to the waterfront. And obviously it will need to be adjusted based on the landscape. However, it's again, it's how long will it take to complete a project like that if we're trying to kind of protect and elevate 47 miles of coast? They broke it down into these smaller projects, into neighborhood-based projects, starting with the most vulnerable in East Houston, East Boston, and downtown, which probably kind of the higher value real estate and the historic core that is the North End. And again, the concept was kind of, okay, so how we create public space that pulls everything together and at the same time provides a protection. And when we're looking at the flood map, what's interesting about Boston is that the Massachusetts and Boston were able to commission their own flood maps. So in the US, the FEMA, the governmental flood and risk maps that are tied to insurance, are historical. They represent historical data of previous events. And they're unable to project into the future and show us the risk with sea level rise. Massachusetts hired Woods Hole Group, a group that's kind of a research team that was able to model different projections with different probabilities for sea level rise and how water will move. So they allowed the design team to kind of have a very detailed view of how water will progress into the urban realm. So these arrows shows us at different time frames, like at different sea elevations, where will water go? And it kind of allows us to phase the project with kind of solving the current flood entry point and then kind of building out to protect a larger area. And the challenges that were identified are one is ownership. So most of the properties at the coast, at the waterfront, are privately owned. So it means that if we want to do any kind of project that is kind of comprehensive, connects everything together, and is managed and paid by the city, we'll need to find a way to kind of negotiate with property owners and find a way to kind of work with everyone. So you need to bring a lot of people to the table to make this happen. The other level of complexity is the subsurface. So there's the Big Dig, if you might have heard. So that's kind of like a subsurface tunnel that was constructed um, in the kind of extent of like 20 years to bury a highway. And then the other layer is this kind of unstable reclaimed soil that was built on stilts and clay and has to have access to groundwater. So, like, whatever we build that blocks the kind of subsurface soil from access to groundwater and the bay will create subsidence and sinking from the perspective of the soil. So the approaches that were brought to the community were like, okay, so we go the left option is like one by land. We take the public right of way, we take what's city owned, and we have this kind of long protective system that might need to be stopped in different areas so people could cross into the water. And that way we avoid private property. Or something that goes by the sea and then kind of brings everything together, but will take a long time to develop. And one of the lessons from this construction of the Big Dig was that um, there wasn't a lot of public participation in the process, even though essentially at the end the project is like what we have now. The Rose Fitzgerald Greenway is positively viewed by the residents of the city. Um, the project itself was kind of viewed as corrupt, and people were very kind of discouraged by the time it took to construct it and by the cost of it. That ended up being $20 billion. So the approach here looks at the private property with a different lens, saying that, okay, we need to provide them options. And the toolkit here is how we can kind of provide multiple options to make this like mix and match um, to increase the ability to build this project. One is kind of like if someone wants to opt out and not be within this protective system, we can build the protective system behind them and connect them back to utilities. Or we can have kind of a low impact public walkway system that also relies on this kind of Massachusetts policy that requires a 3 meter wide pathway at the edges of waterfront properties. Or we can do something that will add new land, reclaim land, and create public space around these properties. And we need to kind of anticipate the different scenarios and alignments and how it might happen, how people will come together, what will make them come together. Do we need to establish a specific agency or city authority to make them work together, or do we need to kind of start providing incentives for some of these properties? And how we can build on like how we can add new land with the understanding that there's a lot of policies involved that are limiting us from doing so, and we need to extend the timeline. So essentially, kind of these implementation pathways are packaged within the timeline of like, okay, so what are all the possibilities and how long it will take, and where is the cutoff where we have to do something for each one of these areas based on our flood map. So within this kind of concept of urban commons, how we can kind of manage and operate, what does it mean? Is it on private land? Is it on public land? How do we kind of start thinking about these spaces? And how do we start thinking about the kind of building the project even before we kind of incorporate the climate risk and the long-term projection? So I'll jump this project and I'll finish at that. So I think kind of one of the takeaways I would like you guys to have from this talk is that while we think of these strategies to transform the built environment to the shifting climate and expanding seas. Um, like how do we kind of communicate the level of risk and the challenges, and how we kind of start layering all of the elements that need to be managed, and how we start making it more accessible to a wider audience of the community, but also how we kind of reflect on the past in order to try to kind of develop new concepts of adaptation. Okay, thank you.